have to make. And in particular, I look forward to these conversations to help me make more informed decisions. So welcome to the second forum in the 24th season of this public policy series. Every month since June of 1995, we've been coming together to try to think out loud together, to try to learn together, to try to address some of the challenges and opportunities that we face as a community and as a Commonwealth. And the hope is that by doing so, we're able to be better informed and make better decisions for ourselves and for our communities and our families. Tonight we're going to take a look at the 3 ballot questions that are before us this year. Some of you will already have voted. The rest of you will vote between now and November 6th or on November 6th, I trust. I've decided that 2 of these 3 questions, well, first of all, a prejudice. For the most part, when initiative petitions come to us, they come to us by virtue of the legislature having failed to act. So I am very embarrassed and disappointed every time that happens. 2 of the issues before us this year fit into that category. The legislature has failed to act on the issue of nurse staffing ratios and has failed to take into account the very changed environment for money and politics in this country. So there are questions on the ballot dealing with those 2. The other question actually comes to us and is different in that it reacts to something the legislature actually has done. So what we're hoping to do this evening is focus most of the attention on question 1, which is the one dealing with nurse staffing ratios, because that's the one that has received the most attention, is the one that is most contentious, it is most complicated. You are being informed by nurses on both sides of the issue. A great deal of money is being spent on this, and hopefully we can get a little bit of clarity about those, the issues behind that and the question on the ballot in the course of this evening's conversation. Before we do that, I want to address, so that's question 1. I want to address very briefly question 2. Question 2 would set up an advisory commission to investigate and make recommendations on the question of money and politics, and very specifically on the question of whether corporations are people or not. The best that we can do by way of legislation and by way of this initiative petition is set up this committee to be advisory. And the only people to advise are the Congress. And you may have noticed how open Congress is to advice. So I don't want to create any false expectation that this is going to produce any great results. But to my way of thinking, there's no argument against advancing the public conversation about the role of money in politics. And I want to encourage you to vote yes on that question. That's question 2. And quite frankly, don't even want to dignify the opposition with an invitation to be here tonight. So that's question 2. Question 3, slightly different, but also there's only one side to that as far as I'm concerned. The legislature in my time has very consistently advanced civil rights. We did it in the form of equal marriage. We did it in the form of transgender rights. There is an effort to repeal what we did by way of extending to transgender individuals the civil liberties and civil rights that all other groups have. Were that to pass, it would be the first time in Massachusetts history that we have withdrawn civil rights from any group. That is untenable, inexcusable, and again, I don't want to dignify those who are advancing that cause with an opportunity to be here to present their case, because it's largely based on false misinformation, if not misleading information, and prejudice. That said, I want to invite Grace Stevens to come up and talk a bit about what the existence of this question on the ballot has done to the trans community in the Commonwealth, because a great deal of damage has done already by virtue of the fact that this is on the ballot, and we want to reverse that damage with a very strong yes vote in November. So, Grace?
Thank you, Jay. Thank you. I'm going to sit. I moved to Lexington in 1977, so you're all my neighbors. I don't know if any of you have have any of your kids. I've coached Little League here for 9 years. I coached USI basketball for about 9 years also in that. Typical suburban dad, that's me. I'm transgender. So who are the people that are transgender? We are your mothers, your fathers, and your children. We are your aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews. We are your grandparents and your grandchildren. We are your teachers and your students. We are your doctors, your lawyers, your pilots. We are your soldiers and your sailors. We are your neighbors, your shopkeepers. We are your friends. And after everything that's been going on this week at the federal level, we will not be erased. That's what's really important about why Massachusetts has to vote yes on 3. And I'm going to talk a bit about that. Has anyone here ever been scared? I love when I ask questions and I get that giggle, you know? That's really
That
cool.
uncomfortable giggle.
Yeah. I have. When I was young, or more accurately, when I was a young boy, there was so much to be afraid of. You know, the boogeyman, the monster under the bed, and all those things that go bump in the night. However, as I grew up, I learned that there was a difference between things that are not real, that I may have been afraid of, and the things that are very real that require action to either conquer or eliminate as the source of my fears. Tonight I'm here to share with you information about ballot question 3, which is a question that, although many people think is complicated, is actually quite simple. Question 3 is simply asking you to agree with the existing law that supports transgender anti-discrimination. If you believe that all people need to be free from discrimination, I ask you to vote yes on 3 to keep our present law and protections in place. It really is as simple as that. Let me go back and talk about fear and being afraid. It seems that the people who are opposed to keeping the existing laws are creating ads and pamphlets that are trying to scare you and telling you that you should be afraid. They're sowing fear, and they will say just about anything, no matter how far it is from the truth, to try to scare you. As I said, one of the major tasks in growing up is becoming willing and able to understand which fears are real and which are fake. The fears the opposition is waving in your face are not real fears, not a single one of them. First, the existing law is called an Act Relative to Transgender Anti-Discrimination. That's all it is. It's a civil rights law. The opposition in all their ads and pamphlets call it the bathroom and locker room law. They're lying from the start. The truth is also quite simple. The law is not about bathrooms. It's not about bedrooms. It's about living room. The right for each person to live freely and express their true selves wherever they go. The present law prevents businesses from discriminating and harassing transgender and gender variant people in public spaces, in stores, parks, movie theaters, restaurants, and even hospitals. That's why it's important to vote yes on 3, to keep people like me safe wherever we go. The opposition's main argument with the present law is that it gives men the right to dress as women, to go into women's bathrooms for the express purpose of perpetrating a crime. They want you to be afraid of this happening. Once again, this argument is exactly like my old fear of the boogeyman or the monster under the bed. It has no truth and facts to back it up. The reality is, since that the present law took effect on October 1st, 2016, 2 years ago, there has been no increased incidence of any of the events the opposition wants you to be afraid of. In fact, most law enforcement organizations, including the Massachusetts Chiefs of Police Association and many cities and towns' chiefs of police, support Yes on 3, as they are fully aware that it's our transgender community who is more at risk of violence perpetrated on them than any other illegal acts taking place. Please be aware that the present law protects all transgender people. Being transgender is just part of being human. Although many of our cultures teach a strict binary normative model of sex and gender, the actual human distribution does not support this. When a culture tries to enforce the binary, it becomes scary and often dangerous if one does not fit within that model. When we talk about fear, this is the minority population that lives in fear of living their true lives. They fear abandonment, loss of friends, family, jobs. They also fear violence against them, and this is shown with many statistics. You may have heard that in repeated studies and surveys of trans people, there is a reported attempted suicide rate exceeding 40% of the population. Every time I say this, I shudder and cannot believe it. But this shows where the fear is and who is truly at risk. I understand that fear is a terrible taskmaster. When afraid, we are running on our stress hormones and ready to fight or flight or freeze. Over the years, I have learned a lot about stress and taught about stress and stress reduction. Stress is actually a perception of a physical or psychological threat to one's being and the perception that one's resources are inadequate to deal with the perceived threat. What this teaches us that stress is a perception rather than reality. And once we learn what's really present and how we can deal with it, the stress can be reduced and removed. The fears the opposition is sowing are not real. They're pushing false perceptions that have no basis in fact. My hope is that once you understand it, you will not be afraid or swayed by their empty arguments. You will see ads and pamphlets, but after listening here, you will know better and be better able to see what the truth is and who's really at risk. The honest truth is that transgender people are not a threat to anyone. They're just people who are trying to live their very best and most authentic lives. How could anyone want to tell them they cannot do that or vote to take away their rights to do so? I, for one, say that the only vote on Yes on 3 only a vote of Yes on 3 can prevent that from happening. I'm going to leave you with 3 takeaways that I call the ABCs of Yes on 3. A, all humans are created equal. B, believe that each person has the right to live their truth. And C, always choose love over fear. Please vote yes on 3. Take questions?
Sure, we have time for a couple of questions if there are any. I just want to add to Grace's very compelling and moving statement, the fact that when this was being debated in the legislature, we kept hearing about all the violence that was going to occur in bathrooms. There has not been a single incident, either before we passed the bill or since, that justifies that claim. Secondly, I think during this past week, we can add to the list of impeachable offenses, if not crimes against humanity, the inanity and insanity that's coming out of the president's mouth. So that should be said.
Right. This is the only statewide ballot in the country, the first statewide ballot. The rest of the country is watching what we do in Massachusetts. It is so important to protect, preserve the dignity, the civil rights of all transgender people. Questions?
Any questions?
I'll be around later if you want questions. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. All ballot questions should be that simple. Question 1 is not. I guess I would just want to invite Eileen Rancouri and Amanda Oberlees to come forward. Both are nurses. Both Amanda and Eileen represent the yes and no positions. I'm happy to report they were sitting together before coming up here. Hopefully they'll still be sitting together or talking together when this is over. And hopefully we will all be better informed and cast more informed votes when we vote on this issue. So Eileen, maybe I'll ask you to go first to make the case for yes.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Representative Kaufman, for letting us speak here tonight with everyone. My name is Eileen Recor, and I'm a bedside nurse at UMass Medical Center in Worcester. I have been at the bedside for 18 years. Currently, I work in a cardiac ICU, and that's been for about 5 years. And prior to that, for the first 13 years of my career, I was on a floor, or acute care medical surgical place. And 5 of those were spent as a travel nurse. So I worked in a few different smaller community hospitals in Central Mass and Lowell, and also in Connecticut. So I've had the opportunity in my career to see that nurses just are not allowed to have the type of say in the patient assignments that we are given. There is no limit to the amount of patients that we take during a shift, and this is crucial. The amount of time that we spend with each patient is crucial to their safety and their well-being. We know that higher patient assignments increase medical errors and prolong hospital stays, and can also result in death and more deaths. So I'm here tonight to hopefully convince anybody who's on the fence or still not really sure about how to vote on question 1, and I'm saying to please vote yes, because your loved ones' lives and possibly yourselves could be in danger, and we need to put some limits on the number of patients that nurses have right now. Thanks.
Great, thank you for that brevity too. So, Amanda?
That's what it is.
The case for no.
Thank you, Representative Kaufman, and thank you to all of you for being here today. It's great to have an audience to talk about ballot question number 1. I'm going to be talking about the no side, and my hope is that you leave here with some more information and clarity on how you are going to vote, or to help talk through any questions that you may have. So I have been a nurse for more than 20 years. We actually have worked in the same hospital before. I spent some time as a traveler nurse at Johns Hopkins, and then went on staff there in the medical ICU and spent many years in the medical ICU taking care of very, very ill patients. Was very fortunate while I was down there to do some graduate studies there. And so I earned a master's in nursing from Hopkins and an MBA. And have just recently graduated with my doctorate degree 2 years ago from Vanderbilt University, studying nursing workforce issues, specifically health services research. So I want to talk to you about question number 1. We believe a no vote for question number 1 is a vote to preserve access to care, a vote to preserve care that's affordable, and to make sure that we have treatment options for substance use or behavioral health patients. We really feel that if this were to pass, it would disproportionately affect hospitals throughout the state, creating a sense, an issue of haves and have-nots in our hospital. And we should never have haves and have-nots when it refers to healthcare. We know that it's going to impact the patient and citizens of our state in 2 ways. Access to care and cost is going to greatly increase costs and decrease potential access to care. We know that this doesn't work in Massachusetts because we already have limits. Irene said we don't have any limits for care. We actually do have a law in Massachusetts in the ICU that has limits in the intensive care unit. And we know that for a year and a half, despite being a law here, it has not improved patient care at all, any patient outcomes. And it has actually had a negative impact in Massachusetts. It's closed 34 ICU beds, 11 of which are NICU beds. beds. Finally, we know that this has been in effect in California for more than 14 years, and there's a lot of things in California that we've gleaned from studying the California experience. It's not something we would want to bring to Massachusetts. Finally, nurses are part of a care team. They're super amazing people, and they do tremendous things. They provide excellent, high-quality care. And I can't say enough good things about nurses. But they're part of a care team. On any given day, there's probably 10 people that touch a patient. And this bill would drastically change how we provide care.
Can I respond to that?
Sure. Why don't you each respond quickly, and then I'm going to force you to be friends and share one of the microphones while I use the other one to go around the audience. So
We are friends. You're not forcing us.
you can move the seats closer together if you dare.
Sure. If I could just speak to the ICU staffing law. So as I said, there are no limits. No, on the acute care, as I was speaking about floor nursing, so med surge, where you would recover from like gallbladder surgery or something like that, or pediatric floors, not in ICU. So yes, in 2014, we were successful in passing a staffing law. However, there are no penalties associated with that law as far as financial penalties. So because in good faith, we thought the hospitals would do the right thing and staff to this law. We know that this is not happening, and that is because they're not being held accountable for that. So a lot of the hospitals that do not have collective bargaining, they are forced to take 3 patients, which they're not supposed to be doing. 2 is the maximum for ICUs in Massachusetts, and hospitals are continuously breaking this law because, again, we thought in good faith they would do the right thing, and they have not been doing that. As far as healthcare costs, California's is not as expensive in Massachusetts as far as the cost of healthcare. Insurance premiums are less for healthcare workers and others in California, less than Massachusetts. So those things are just not true. As far as ICU closures, I'm not really sure what hospitals can report that, because none in Central Mass that I've heard of, but that's my response. Sorry, I'm really nervous.
Amanda, do you want to say something, and then I'll...
No, I'll just counter one of the statements that you just made. Actually, the average hospital bill for patients in Massachusetts versus California. Massachusetts averages around $28,000 per hospital stay, whereas California is $66,000. So the national average for a hospital stay is about $41,000. So Massachusetts comes in below that for a average hospital stay cost.
So let me start with a question that came via email. Opponents say that this will drain nurses, that this being the proposition before us, will drain nurses from mental health hospitals and wards to meet the needs if it passes. Why? Are mental health hospitals not covered in this initiative? What about nursing home nurses? Is this a real issue? Many people I know say they are voting no because of this projected outcome.
Sure. So first, there's a couple of questions in there. So in terms of how it's going to impact behavioral health, it's estimated that it's going to cost behavioral health beds or hospitals and facilities and units, $223 million a year. And it's expected a closure of 1,000 behavioral health beds in Massachusetts. And this was out of a study by the Massachusetts Association for Behavioral Health. So we really don't want that to happen. When we talk to voters and we have focus groups, we ask them what's going well in Massachusetts, or what do you think about, what are you most concerned about? Within about 3 seconds, people bring up the opioid crisis. We're in the middle of an opioid crisis right now in our region of the country and other places throughout the country. We do not need to do anything right now that is going to limit or restrict or decrease access to behavioral health beds. In terms of how this is going to affect communities, what we saw in California is that the passage of this bill created a huge, huge demand for nurses in California, and there was a decreased supply. So there was a shortage of nurses. And what does that do in the market? That increases wages. So wages increased in California when this passed to the tune of about 7 to 10%. Shifting those estimates to Massachusetts, if we are expecting wages to increase in acute care in hospitals, We are thinking that if wages go up in hospitals, nurses from the community are going to be attracted back into hospitals. So nurses that do hospice care, visiting nurses, home health nurses, school nurses, academia, et cetera, are going to be pulled back into acute care. For years, we've been trying to move care into the community and to focus on a wellness model and not a sick model. The hospital and acute care, that's a sick model. So we want more care happening in the community. This is going to back us up maybe a decade in terms of the progress we've been making and moving care into the community. And again, we feel that this is going to pull resources and nurses back into acute care.
Okay. Eileen, do you want to respond to that as well?
Yes.
And then we'll move on to get ready with your question.
So going through bedside nursing, or being a bedside nurse for 13 years, going through school, you know, people have a very specific niche as to what they want to do, right? So if you're a school nurse, you're going to stay a school nurse. If you're a hospice nurse, you're going to stay a hospice nurse. You're not going to go fleeing your chosen profession, because nursing really is, it's a calling. And so if your calling is to take care of the dying patient in their home and to make sure they die with dignity, that's where you're going to stay. You're not going to go flocking to the hospitals because now all of a sudden there's a 6% increase in wages, okay? This will bring, or keep, I should say, bedside nurses at the bedside because it's more manageable. If I'm a new grad and I'm just out of school and I'm caring for 8 patients and I have 2 complaining of chest pain at the same time, if I bring that down to 4, that's a much more manageable assignment for me, and it's also safer for those 2 patients, for my 4 patients total. So this thought that people are going to come, you know, out of mental health or hospice or schools, I just don't believe that's going to happen. And if you're a nurse, you know nurses, and they stay where they want to stay. They don't go necessarily for money. Now, if you're working in a smaller community hospital as a med-surg nurse, maybe you would be more attracted because now the ratios are better, it's safer care. You're being able to give the care that you were educated and trained to give, not, you know, just putting out fires everywhere you go. That might attract you back to a bigger hospital or, you know, Boston or something like that. And then as far as the mental health, this is what really, this makes me so mad when they talk about the closure of mental health services and the opiate epidemic. I live in Worcester, okay? We are affected hugely by the opiate epidemic, as are other regions in our state and throughout the country. Less than 2 years ago, our hospital, UMass Medical Center, closed 13 psychiatric beds. 13 psychiatric beds because they said there wasn't a need for it. I don't believe that. They're not making money off of the psychiatric patients or the opiate epidemic, okay? But up the road in Westboro, which is about, I don't know, 15, 20 miles, there is now a for-profit psychiatric place being opened. So we took the beds out of an inner city and put them in Metro West, where it's not as easy access for the people that need it, which is in our community where the opiate epidemic is happening. So that's just crazy. Yes, mental health beds are closing, but not because of this bill.
Okay, sure. Quick rebuttal and then.
Sure. So just briefly, there is actually a new state-of-the-art behavioral health facility in Massachusetts that cannot open because we don't have nurses to staff that facility. Right now, there's a shortage of nurses in Massachusetts, 1,200 nursing vacancies, and we cannot fill those. So this is a specialty that is hard to recruit for. So you did mention that behavioral health beds aren't reimbursed. They're reimbursed about 60 cents on the dollar. What's troubling about the way that this bill is written is that if you look at the numbers for behavioral health, it states it's a 1-to-5 ratio. And right now, that's not how we practice for behavioral health. We do have some RNs taking care of behavioral health patients, but we have another role group called mental health counselors. And so they play a large role in caring for behavioral health patients. And so by now inserting a ratio that's not really relevant to how we practice now, it's going to completely change what we call like the milieu and how we provide behavioral health care. So it's now forcing nurses into that space where sometimes there is another role group that is very, very skilled and educated on how to provide care for that population.
Okay, who wants the first question? Okay.
Hi, I have a question for you as the no opponent. Is there a way this bill could have been written better that you would have supported?
Yeah, I don't know that we have enough time to go through those. This is a law. These are not guidelines, they're not suggestions, they're not recommendations. So the rigidity is really concerning to myself and a lot of colleagues because it doesn't allow nurses and other healthcare providers to provide what the patient needs. It's now imposing these numbers onto patients, and I can go into much more detail or examples. So the at all times is a problem. The specific numbers and the rigidity around that. Fines that will probably put hospitals out of business if they don't go out of business in two ways. Losing money on beds because they're going to have to suppress them because they can't find the nurses, or if they hire the nurses, that's another financial hit. They're being hit both ways. So it's going to greatly impact and close hospitals throughout the state. We know that from California, there are 36 fewer hospitals in California now than before their law passed, and the same could happen here in Massachusetts.
Oh, sorry. Question.
Okay, next question. I'll come back to you next.
My question basically is to Jay. If this passes, isn't the legislature able to change some of these specific provisions if they turn out to be as catastrophic as the no side is complaining?
The one-word answer is yes. There is no question about the fact that I have heard none of my colleagues who is supporting this bill who would defend it chapter and verse. So the assumption is that were this to pass, it would have to undergo a major overhaul in the course of the legislative process. Is that a fair statement?
I have a question for you.
Okay.
If you want, speak to that, and I go back to what you said earlier.
So I would ask, should we be passing laws that are so flawed that they need work on the back end, number one? I'm having flashbacks to our marijuana law here. Number two,
Me too.
yeah. So should we be voting on a law hoping or crossing our fingers that it will change? Ballot questions are not a great way to make policy at all. They take away the legislative process, this ability to debate and really create great policy. So should we be passing it? I don't think so. My other question was to you, Representative. My understanding is that, and lawyers have confirmed this, that the law does go into effect on January 1, 2019. And the legislative session is not back in session. So how can we adapt or adopt or change a question, a ballot question, if the legislative session is not even in session? So I would love to learn how that happens.
Well, we actually are in session, just technically not having roll call votes, but we can pass things as long as there's no objection. And my instinct is, and this is just instinct, that were this to pass on November 6th, by November 7th, there would be a bill introduced and probably passed without objection, delaying the implementation by some period of time. For just the reasons that you stated. Don't take that to the bank, but it could happen.
So again, speaking of the ICU staffing law, we were able to get that, we got that passed in 2014. However, it took time for every hospital to develop their acuity tool. No hospitals were held accountable until everyone's acuity tool was in place. So again, this claim that 37 days, we're going to hire nurses, and then, and also I think it's crazy, like we're already talking about hospitals going out of business because they're not going to comply with the law. So we're already talking about not staffing safely before the law is even passed. Every time the hospital is fined $25,000, well, why are we already talking about the hospitals that are going to be not complying with the law if it passes, right? So 37 days, not true. Yes, it goes into effect, but it will not be enforced, just as the ICU staffing law was not enforced. I think it was mid-2016 that it finally was rolled out. And it's just, hospitals are not already talking about not complying with safe staffing. So that to me is concerning.
So I just want to say that the law as written and how we should interpret it and vote on it is that it does go into effect on January 1, 2019. For those of you who might have a copy of it or go home tonight and look it up, I would call your attention to Section 231E and read the last two sentences there, where it specifically states that there is not to be any delay in implementation, any waiver or exception for rolling this out. So please pay close attention to that.
Back here, and then I'm going to move to this side of the room.
Thank you. I need to start by saying that I hate for this to be decided by referendum. It seems insane to me that decisions such as this should be made by a relatively uninformed public on this matter. I was just interested to hear about the shortfall of 1,200 nurses in the state now, and I'd like the proponents to explain to me then where the staffing will come from in a situation where we have such a shortfall.
So we do not really have, we're one of two states that does not have a severe nursing shortage as everybody in the rest of the country is suffering from. And the state of Massachusetts graduates 3,000 plus nurses every year. 3,000 plus nurses every year. At many of the hospitals, as has become the trend in the last 10 years or so, there are not many full-time positions. This has a lot to do with the paying of benefits and things like that. So there are many, many nurses, especially new nurses, that are hired as part-time, that work full-time. They're not getting full-time benefits because the hospital doesn't want to pay for it, but they would like to work full-time. So they would take a full-time position in a heartbeat. So yes, there's 1,200 vacancies. I'm not really sure why they're not hiring. In the ICU I work in, okay, this is a perfect example. We have been short 3 nurses pretty much every week since February. We just introduced a new kind of heart assistive device, right? So it's pretty involved, and there was a lot of education, and so people were off the unit doing education, things like that. So we were short 3 nurses pretty much for the whole week. So we have a float pool, right? That is just in case staffing, if somebody calls in, that kind of stuff. We've been staffing our unit with these float pool nurses for the last 6 or 7 months. And yet when we say to the administration, we need more nurses because you know what? You're paying all of these other people overtime to fill these slots. So overtime, that's crazy. Why would you pay somebody overtime when you can just hire more nurses? So the slots are there. Hospitals are not hiring them, and they're not hiring full-time nurses. And that would take care of the vacancies as well as the 3,000 graduated nurses every year.
Thank you. My colleague said she works at UMass. I would encourage all of you to look maybe on the jobs board at UMass. I'm guaranteeing you that there'll probably be some positions that are posted for nurses that aren't being filled, and we can't find the nurses for them. So there are 1,200 nursing positions that we cannot fill right now in Massachusetts. We graduate about 3,500 nurses each year, and about 4,000 retire. In terms of how we compare to California, despite California having this law for more than 14 years, we have more than double the number of nurses per capita in our state compared to California. We have 1,300, they have about 600. Not many positions, I heard my colleagues say over here, and they don't want to hire nurses for full-time because we don't want to pay them benefits. Nursing, like some other professions, nursing workforces really follow the economy. When we're in a very robust economy right now, and when we are in a good economy, nurses pull back their hours. So because they might be part of a dual income family structure. When the economy goes through a downturn, and there are maybe 2 wage earners in a household, maybe 1 wage earner is laid off or their hours are reduced. Nursing hours at that time spike and they go up, and nurses move into more full-time. So when we are in a good economy, nursing hours are pulled back. Dr. Burhouse is a world-renowned expert on nursing workforce issues. He did a study recently that was released in January 2017 that compared all of the census regions throughout the country. And we can have a national shortage, which we have a sort of a national shortage right now, but all nursing markets are local. We can have pockets of the country that have a surplus of nurses and pockets in the country that have a deficit of nurses. Census Massachusetts region number 1, or New England, has the highest number of nurses over 50 and the lowest number of nurses under 40. I'll just let that sink in for a second when you compare it to the other areas. It takes sometimes 6 months to 12 months to find nurses in certain specialty areas, behavioral health, the OR, ER. So it takes a long time to hire nurses. We do have a shortage. If this bill passes, we're expected our shortage to grow from 1,200 nurses to 5,900 nurses.
I saw a question over here. There we go.
Thank you both for participating tonight. I was curious about the experiences in other states, for example, California or elsewhere, from a patient standpoint in terms of quality of care, access to care, and other considerations. Thanks.
Do you want me to start with that one?
Sure.
So we learned a lot from California, and despite, again, having this for 14 years, they do not outperform. People come from all around the country and all around the world to Massachusetts to receive health care in our state because it is phenomenal. In terms of how Massachusetts outperforms California, it outperforms California in these areas: mortality, infections, patient safety, ER wait times, patient satisfaction, overall performance, prevention and treatment, 30-day hospital mortality, infant mortality, hospital discharge instructions, patient-centered hospital care, and the Leapfrog Safety Group. There are independent organizations that grade states and healthcare systems. Massachusetts, in 2018, received a Leapfrog Safety Grade of number 4 in the country. California was a number 25. 2018, Massachusetts was number 1 with healthiest states in the country. California was a 17. California is not a model we should be aspiring to.
I'd just like to speak to that. So I don't have a lot of statistics that she has because I don't do this normally, so bear with me. But I do know that wait times are much better in California than they are here. 47% shorter, as a matter of fact, in the ER. And as far as improvement in mortality, there are many studies that say differently. And on safepatientlimits.org, you can look those up. I don't have them in my mind or in my notes here. But I would say yes, Massachusetts is ranked very high for excellent care at some hospitals, such as Mass General, which guess what their nursing ratios are at Mass General? They get 3 patients on their med-surg floors. So there is a direct correlation between the number of patients that a nurse has and mortality, hospital-acquired infections, death from complications, medical errors. Your rate of injury or death from a hospital admission goes up 7% for every patient that a nurse has over 4. That's a statistic that's real. And so yes, MGH, Beth Israel, some of those give absolute wonderful care, and people come from all over the world there because their nursing ratios are 1 to 3 or already 1 to 4. So why not the rest of the state? Why not in the Berkshires? Why not in Worcester? I say everybody deserves that type of care, right?
So you two are not politicians. If you were, I hear you each completely disagreeing with each other, and I would expect that, and that would be fine. But you're both professionals, and you're very thoughtful, you're intelligent, you've looked into this, you each have many factors that you've listed, and you completely disagree with each other. And for me at least, it makes it, I feel like it's impossible to figure this out. Like I can't tell who's right. You say 7%, 4%. It's like, I need a nurse. I don't know.
So can I answer that very simply? If you are the patient in that bed, or your mother, or your wife, or your child, or somebody that you love, and your nurse has 8 patients, would you rather have them 4? Can they give you more care if they have, or better care, or safer care if they only have 4 patients, or if they have 8 patients? If you're a teacher in a classroom, I don't know how many teachers are here, okay? If you have 50 students, how much attention can you give each student? Very little, right? Even with 20 or even 15. It's tough, right? So they might not learn that well that day because you have 25 or you don't have, an assistant there with you. But this is life or death. This is the difference between you coming out of your hospitalization better than when you went in the door. So yes, all those statistics matter, but I think it's pretty much common sense. Less patients equals better care. I can spend more time with you. I can talk to you in the morning instead of just giving you pills very quickly, and I can tell that you're very much with it. You know who you are, you know where you are, you don't have a facial droop. But if I don't have that much time to spend with you, 3 or 4 hours down the road, you now have the small facial droop, but I didn't notice that earlier, or you're a little confused. You could be having a stroke. It is minutes that can make the difference between whether you survive that stroke, whether you come out of it completely okay, or whether you suffer terrible complications. So 4 or 8, which do you want your nurse to have? 4 patients or 8 patients? And that's really what it comes down to, because 4 is the safest.
So thank you for your question, and I think it reminds me of a comment we heard over here at the beginning about why this is on the ballot, and I think this is a sad time for nursing in our state. I am confident that there will be brighter days ahead, and we are going to be part of the group that leads what happens on the other side of November 6th. In terms of the research that you've alluded to and examples that you've given, in terms of what the research states, it's not as simple as equating the research that's out there that talks about more nursing hours or more nurses or fewer patients per nurse. What you've done with the ballot question is that you've tied the hands of nurses and other healthcare providers. And so when you put a rigid artificial ratio around how a nurse practices, that's when it becomes not good for patients. And so I'll just give you a quick example. Sometimes the best thing for a patient, and this is a nurse saying this, sometimes the best thing for a patient isn't another nurse. Or more nursing hours. Sometimes a patient needs more pharmacy hours, or sometimes a patient could benefit. I hope I said patient. Sometimes a patient could benefit from more pharmacists around them, or a nurse's aide. Sometimes when I would receive more FTEs or nursing positions in my budget, I would gather my staff around and I would say, okay, we just have 2.5 more positions added to our budget. How are we going to deploy these nurses? And they would say right away, actually, we would really love a PCA or a nurse's aide on night shift. In the emergency room, sometimes the best thing for the patient is a pharmacist or another healthcare provider, a patient safety officer. So it's not always a nurse that's needed. Again, we are but one of 10 people that probably touch a patient on a day. And if this were to pass, you better believe that it's going to wipe out supports for nurses, and nurses are now not going to be doing a lot more nursing care. Nurses can practice nursing now. But if this were to pass, we would have to eliminate so many supports that we've worked for years to bring around nurses. And now nurses, instead of taking care of patients and practicing nursing, are going to be doing AM care, PM care, phlebotomy, finger sticks, vital signs, making a sandwich, transcribing orders, reconstituting medications. They're not going to have time to spend with their patients because all of their supports will be wiped out, all of them.
Okay. One question here, and then I'm going to move back to this side of the room.
Hi, I have been a nurse for 40 years, and as you can imagine, friends are calling, what should I do on this question? I think you can see, I think you mentioned the complexity here. Both of these people are very good. They believe strongly in their position. And I guess this one has my husband's position. And just let's vote yes and shake them up and see what they do about it, because it's a problem. And this one, the yes or the no vote, I think is probably the better way to go. I agree with you. This is not a good thing. I actually thought that the legislature wouldn't ever wade into this problem. I don't see them as any more learned or better to make this decision than we are. The things we're not discussing here are the hospitals that have closed because of reimbursement rates being so low. Mental health, my husband is a mental health provider, and that's just out the window now because they don't pay them anything. So no one is going into mental health services. So the health insurance, we can't even go there. It's their reimbursement to everyone that, or lack thereof, that is really changing the whole milieu. And the whole process needs to be fixed. But I can tell you, when we had 2 charge nurses with 40 beds on the floor, we were running like crazy, okay? So I'm not sure. I tell my friends now, don't ever go to a hospital without calling me. Don't go alone, because you will not get the care.
That is sad.
just don't have the time and the staff. These nurses need to be supported, but probably not in this initiative.
That's really sad, and I'm sad to hear that, because it makes me angry that I'm not able to give the care that patients deserve. And I would venture to say, I mean, I love and respect all of the healthcare providers that are on our team. Our respiratory therapists, I don't know what I would do without them, with our aides, with pharmacy, when we have questions to call them up. All of those people are extremely valuable, but this bill is not going to eliminate them. It's just not going to happen, and if it happens, that's a violation. And also, it's really where the hospital decides to put the cost. Are they going to eliminate them because they don't want to take from salaries at the top, or do they want to provide better patient care? Because to keep them, and you know, we get into the healthcare profession to take care of people and to make them better and to do no harm. So if it's a matter of cost or do no harm, like, that's a no-brainer. It really is. I get it's a business. I know it's a business. $1 billion in profits, the healthcare industry in Massachusetts every year. But if it's a business and your end product is a healthy, safe patient at the end of their admission, then why don't you put the money where the product is, where the nurses can take care of your patient adequately and safely and give the care that they deserve? And you know what? You are equipped to make this decision because you're paying for that care in the end, if you're the patient in the bed or if it's your loved one in the bed. So why wouldn't we, right? And I'm sad that it's come to this, because we've been trying for 20 plus years to get this passed, safe staffing.
I just feel like I need to respond to a couple of things. This is an unfunded mandate. This is not being passed and a bucket of money will be, shared with each hospital for them to find the millions upon millions of dollars to hire the staff. Right now in Massachusetts, there are about 68 hospitals. There are 14 right now operating in the red. They have a red margin, meaning they're not making a profit. If this were to pass, it is projected that another 25 will be operating in the red, bringing that total to 39 hospitals out of our 68, more than half of our hospitals operating in the red. We can't afford to have one hospital close, never mind, more than one. And then in terms of, you mentioned hospital profits, I believe last year's combined out of the whole entire state, the hospital margin or profits was about $750 million. This is expected to cost more than $1 billion every single year, wiping out those profits, or not the profits, but the margins for these hospitals. I'll give you one quick example, just because my colleague lives up in Newburyport. There's a small community hospital up there called Anna Jakes, and her family receives care there. Her father went there for atrial fibrillation, a fast heart rate. Her mother went there recently to be treated for pneumonia. This is expected to cost this small community hospital $3.5 million. Their margin last year was $500,000. How can we need our community hospitals? Again, remember how I opened up and I said this could potentially create this sense of the haves and the have-nots, and that has no place in healthcare. In terms of social justice, the social justice vote is definitely a no vote.
So let me just note to Michelle Sicolo, good luck. Richard?
So my question is about sort of the balance here.
I'm sorry, it's about the what?
The balance, which is, there was a very good evaluation done in California. And as far as I can tell, it said fewer patients died, nurses who were retained more often. What it doesn't say is how much it costs. And I'm trying to figure out what the balance is. And you're throwing out a lot of numbers about margins, but has anybody done a real cost estimate to say how much it's going to cost?
Yes, absolutely. So there are two independent studies right now that have estimated the cost. So one was done by Mass Insight. They projected that the cost on year one would be $1.31 billion to the state, and that would be year one. Year after year, it'd be about $900 million year after year. The Health Policy Commission on October 3rd just released a really fantastic report that I would encourage everyone to Google Health Policy Report Massachusetts October 3rd, and you should be able to find it. They estimated the cost to be approximately $950 million. And what that did not include were the emergency rooms and post-acutes. You add those in, and you're going to get a number similar pushing past $1 billion. Again, this is an unfunded mandate. It's going to cost our state about $1 billion, and there's no guarantee that patient care will be improved at all. And it's going to tie the hands of nurses and other healthcare providers.
Let me just point out, we've got officially only about 5 minutes left. I'm going to try to stretch that a
Sure.
little bit.
Nice.
But
Really
let's
quick.
be as brief as we can be with
You gotcha.
questions and answers.
You got it. So the first thing about the Healthcare Policy Commission study, which to me was a sham from the get-go, because it says that each nurse was going to cost $300,000. I don't know. I've got a hole in my shoe here today, so I'm telling you right now, $300,000 for the average bedside nurse, okay? That is crazy. Even if you count non-wage benefits, okay? $300,000 per nurse. Plus, it also said that assumed the 4 to 6% raise for every single nurse in the Commonwealth. They even counted nurses that weren't working at the bedside. So it was not really independent. They did not consult us. They only consulted the Massachusetts Hospital Association, used their numbers, their figures. They did not talk to the nurses. And that's what I have to say about that.
Just two quick points. There was a firewall between the Massachusetts Hospital Association and Mass Insight. There was absolutely no communication during the whole time that they ran those numbers. And what's interesting is that the Health Policy Commission, which is, again, another independent study, came up with a very similar number. And then you mentioned the HPC study being a sham, yet the HPC is listed in the bill that you authored 9 times. So it was good enough to be included and selected as the governing body of your bill.
As far as $300,000 per nurse.
But now it's a sham. In terms of $300,000 per nurse, it's not $300,000 per nurse, but you're taking the total number, I think, of what the estimate was and dividing it by how many nurses are needed, and that's...
Okay, well, we can't go back to the numbers. Go ahead.
Hi, I've been a nurse for 35 years. 3 different hospitals, currently in the recovery room for the last 15 years. This is an apples and oranges. I don't know how. Nurses are split right down the middle. They're still my coworkers. They're still my family. I will take care of you no matter what. Nurses instinctively want to take care of patients. I'm willing to be fined to take care of all of you. I think nurses do that. However, it is so much of an apples and oranges situation, to speak to this gentleman's point, that I don't know how I could possibly vote for something that is so divisive. And where I work, we are one of the safest hospitals by one of the groups that you spoke to, that is a secret shopper kind of thing. They come in, you don't know they're there, and then we find out that we're one of the safest hospitals in the country. And to speak to that, they've already started, in anticipation of this passing, to not fill nursing assistant jobs. That scares the daylights out of me. Nursing assistants are our lifeblood. They allow me to spend my time with my patients. If they are not there, I'm doing everything they do, and then where's the quality?
So let me propose that the last couple of questions come from people who are genuinely undecided. Okay, if there's anybody left.
I have a question, and that is, patients who are in the hospital now are much sicker than they ever have been. They're acutely ill, because if they're not, then they're shipped home. And I have recently had experiences, probably like many people in this room, having elderly parents in the hospital. I'm afraid to leave them often. And so my sisters and I would take shifts because we were afraid. So my question to the no vote is, how are hospitals going to ensure there is a nursing problem? How, if we don't have this, we don't have laws with ratios, how are the hospitals going to make sure that there are enough nurses to take care of the patients?
So thank you for asking that question. So this being an unfunded bill, and having 1,200 nursing shortages right now, or 1,200 positions we can't fill, this bill is not going to create more nurses automatically. What it's going to do is create a larger shortage of nurses. But but the bill is not the answer to what you're looking for. What we should be advocating is for more nursing hours, not for rigid mandates and not for rigid ratios and tying the hands of nurses. Patients are sicker now that. But I would encourage you to pick a hospital, pick your local hospital that you attend to, and look at their jobs board. I can guarantee you there are job openings that they are very much trying to hire for. In the last, I believe the number is the last 10 years, they have added 11,000 new nursing positions throughout the state of Massachusetts. And again, we have 1,200 positions that we're trying to hire for. Sometimes it takes a year to find a nurse for a labor and delivery unit. So patients are very sick these days. It takes a physician to admit you to the hospital, and it takes a nurse to get you out of the hospital. And this is all planned in terms of we want care moved into the community, and we want less focus on acute care. If you're in the hospital, you really need to be there, and you need to be there because you're receiving nursing care. If this were to pass, it's not going to create more nurses. What it's going to do is strip the support of nurses, and nurses are going to be very challenged getting to you and providing care for you.
Go ahead, sorry. Yeah.
No, just let me just say
Okay.
the alternative to doing this by legislation is to do it by regulation. That has not happened. But to Michelle, one of the options is for the legislature to step in, and this is independent of whether the yes vote or no vote prevails in November, and demand that the regulatory process operate the way it is supposed to do. But it hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I can't deny that.
You know, believe it or not, when we become nurses, like nursing has become so technological, and also because patients are so much sicker, we've almost become practical doctors at the bedside, right? So we're managing equipment and things like that. Nurses go into nursing because they want to care for people. They want to give that back rub. They want to, look at every inch of your skin and make sure you, if as a diabetic, don't have any ulcers, things like that. If I have 4 patients on the floor, I'm going to be able to do that, and hopefully with the help of the nursing assistants, because they will not be eliminated or cut because of this bill. They might be. Hospitals hire and fire all the time. UMass hired 100% of their nursing educators. You would think educators would be important in a hospital, right? Fired 100% of their nurse educators in the last 6 or 7 months, and then hired 50% of them back. So do hospitals hire and fire? Yes, but they would not be hiring or firing nursing assistants or respiratory therapists or any of those caregivers that help us to take care of your loved one in that bed. But if I have 4 patients, I can provide that care, and I can do it really, really well. And your loved one is going to be able to get out of the hospital sooner.
Rather than going back and forth on this, let's ask another question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I feel obligated to ask. I understand that our yes vote is a nurse, and I understand that you're no longer a nurse. You've gotten a higher degree, and I'm wondering who you work for now.
No, I am a nurse. Once you're a nurse, you're always a nurse. I have an active license.
I understand the philosophy,
Oh,
but
yes,
who are you
yes.
working for?
Yes,
Are you with the union?
No, I'm not. I'm the CEO for the Organization of Nurse Leaders. So we do nursing education, nurse leadership education. So we believe that every nurse is a leader, nurses at the bedside to nurses in the C-suite and everything in between. And we also look at health policy. What we haven't talked about a lot tonight is the patient. And this is not going to be good for the patient. It's going to restrict access, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And this could be a little bit more palatable if there was 1 ounce of certainty that patient care would be improved if this passes. But I fear that patient care will be greatly, greatly decreased.
Okay, we've got time for 2 more quick questions, and then, well, maybe 3. At what point do we run out of tape? That's the question.
All right.
Okay.
So as the fellow mentioned and others have mentioned, the apples, oranges, it's extremely difficult to try to wade through it. And I couldn't agree more with actually how Jay framed it. It's kind of a failure when it happens here. But I do think that there's a couple of aspects that stand out to me. And one is that you started in sort of carefully framed, thoughtful, deliberative postures, and then rapidly began fear-mongering, both of you. We have patients will die if we don't do this, and hospitals will close. And I don't think either of those are anything you could guarantee.
Well,
And you'll tell me how I'm wrong, I'm sure, but
let me just-
but the issue is that for a voter, we would like to feel like this moves us in the right direction, and the odds are that neither of the histrionic consequences will really come to pass the way that you framed them. There, of course, would be an expectation that there's a financial hit. Obviously, there's financial hit. We don't really know how big it'll be, and what's the consequence there. But would you vote for this if the ratio had been 1 to 6?
Absolutely not.
So how in the world has science led you to the one true number? And my concern is we're being asked to believe that you have determined the one true number. And I have a very hard time with that. But I also think that, as you said, the regulatory bodies have failed us. The people who should be looking into the safety and monitoring and regulation, which would seem like the right body to do it, whether they're perfect or not. And so if we don't go along with this, then we've kind of endorsed that nothing happens and the status quo is okay with the hospitals determining whether they feel safe or not. So that's kind of a challenge. So I guess I'm kind of undecided in that, and thinking that you are both raising the stakes a little too extremely, and maybe we could be more thoughtful.
So let me just ask that you not respond to that. Because for two reasons. One is I think you should take that as a statement in reaction to what was said here tonight. And second, I think we can predict your reactions anyway. So let's move on to two more quick questions.
So
Thank you for the statement, though.
my question is about the don't tie my hands.
I'm sorry, the what?
Don't tie my hands, and I've seen that as an argument. So getting back to the teacher example, I sincerely doubt that there are any teachers at Bowman Elementary here in town where my daughter went, that I would be very surprised if there was a single teacher there who would say, don't tie my hands, let me take on 50 students if I want to. And I'm seeing the same thing here. I mean, I'm just not following here that don't tie my hands, let me take on 8 patients if that's not safe. I mean, that just...
Sure,
I'm not following that.
if I could just say 2 quick things to that. So usually, tonight it was the teacher. Usually it's the daycare provider. Don't you have limits at your daycare? And I would say we are very different than a daycare at a hospital. So when I wanted to enroll my child in daycare, they were at their limit and they said, I'm sorry, we need to turn you away or we can put you on a wait list. We cannot do that in our emergency rooms. And if this were to pass, nurses on every shift that they work might be challenged with which law are they going to break. We have EMTALA. We have, if this were to pass, this patient safety ratio law. And we would have this no diversion policy. This would tie the hands of nurses if this were to pass. And so nurses are now going to have to think about, okay, so am I going to refuse this patient or am I going to accept this patient and break the staffing law? Or am I going to refuse the patient and break the EMTALA law? When you have a nurse on a general care unit that has 4 patients and they're all ready to go home, they have their discharge orders done, they have their IV taken out, they're waiting for a loved one to come and pick them up from the hospital. And you have another nurse here with 2 very, very sick patients. They don't have 4 patients, they have 2 very, very sick patients that are probably going to be transferred to the ICU. And now there's an admission coming to the floor. How we practice right now is that the nurse that had the 4 patients that are stable and waiting for a ride home, we would give that nurse the patient. And we would protect this nurse that had 2 very ill patients, and we'd try to see if we could put more supports for that nurse and support those patients. It's all about what the patient needs. This brings it down to nurses are numbers and patients are numbers, and that's just not right.
How about a real quick response?
Really quick.
One last
so
question.
That's just, it's ridiculous. If you're in an emergency room and you're sick, and first you can't EMTALA says you can't, and if you're a nurse that is now over your limit, so you're over the limit because you're going to care for that patient, nothing is going to change as far as what you do as a bedside nurse, okay? What has to change is what the hospital does. So they need to plan accordingly. Right now, UMass only staffs at 78%. 78%. So that if there are call-ins or snowstorms or there's a surge in people coming into the emergency room, they can't plan for that. They can't staff for that, rather, because They're already staffing below what they should be staffing. So the nurse at the bedside, nothing changes. You're in the emergency room. As an emergency room nurse, you're going to care for that patient just as you did before this law. The hospital needs to stop and change and look at their practices, and they'll be fined, not the nurse. That is a huge fallacy. That's a farce.
Last question.
That kind of brings up what my question was. What is the penalty if, in fact, there are 4 nurses in emergency, another person comes in, and there are 4 nurses someplace else, but there are only 4 nurses who are supposed to be able to take care of emergency. Another person, I comes in with a heart attack. What happens? You're going to take a nurse from someplace else, and somebody's got to pay a penalty because that nurse is not allowed. She's not one of the 4. I'm not one of the 4 that she's allowed. I'm a 5th one. So who's going to take care of me? Who's going to pay for it or maybe I will if I just pass away, right?
So if I can just address the 78%, a hospital staffs at 78%. The unit that I used to work at Mass General, I think we used to staff it at 89%. Why wouldn't hospitals staff at 100%? If you think about what happens in a hospital, for those of you who may have been a patient or with a loved one, the bed is not 100% filled. You have a discharge, and then you wait to get an admission. And sometimes a bed is vacant for an hour or 2 while it is cleaned and turned over. And so you never have a unit staffed around 100% because there is time that the bed is vacant for turnover and cleaning. So I just wanted to make sure that was known.
All right, so we are so unfortunately...
Yes, can I just please respond to? So if you were to present, you would have to wait or you would have to go to another emergency room. That's just what would happen. Or we could take care of you and then someone else would have to wait.
So for good or ill, we're at the limits of our time and maybe our endurance.
I'm sorry, you would not have to go to another emergency room. You would be cared for.
I never said this was going to be easy, but I just want to thank Amanda and Eileen for being here tonight. Grace as well, thank you for being here tonight. I would invite the 2 of you and Grace, wherever Grace is, to stick around if you have any questions directly of them. I'm sure they'd be happy to engage with you. Let me also shamelessly invite you to be part of the conversations next month. There will be. You're not dismissed yet. Next month, there will not be 1 but 3 open house forums looking at different aspects of leadership. Many of you know that I've started a nonprofit organization to be my new home after I leave the legislature because I've noticed there's some room for improvement in public sector leadership. So I'm planning to see what I could do about that, and there will be a bit of a preview of that on the 1st, 15th, and 29th of November at the community center. More about that in the press and in my releases over the next couple of weeks. Meanwhile, vote on November 6th. However complicated this issue is, your vote is absolutely critical and will be dispositive. And thank you very much for being part of this conversation here tonight. Good night.